Well, it is 10:01, so we will go ahead and get started. We still have some people coming in, which is marvelous news. So we'll just kind of get the introduction started. Welcome, everyone, to the Bentley Rare Book Museum's virtual Coffee with a Curator program. If this is your first time attending the program, again, huge welcome. We are so happy that you joined us this Wednesday morning. If you've been attending the programs, thank you again. I love the fact that so many people make time in their week for this program, or in their month, I should say, for this program. It's just absolutely amazing to see all these faces, and we learn so many new things each month. So thank you all again. I don't want to take that for granted. Really, really appreciate it. So we are definitely in for a treat today. We have so many things that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to kind of do some time travel, as we often do. This time we're going to go back into the 18th century. And I must say, when I think of the 18th century, I often think about events like the American and French revolutions. They come to mind, as do systemic tragedies like the transatlantic slave trade. I think about works of literature like Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, the poetry of Phillis Wheatley, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. However, there is one overarching movement that I think largely characterizes this entire century, and that would be the Age of Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that influenced the way people thought about science, literature, history, politics, and society in general. Enlightenment thinkers believed that humans should seek knowledge, reason, and objectivity above all else, rebelling against previous traditions of superstition and religious authority. Today, we are going to view the 18th century and the Enlightenment through several very different lenses. And so that's going to be kind of a fun way. We're going to look at it from many different perspectives and how it manifested. But before we get into the main content of the program, as always, I would like to ask Andrew to lead us in our Where's Andrew segment for those who are new. Andrew Bramlett. Andrew, can you raise your hand? Andrew Bramlett actually changes his background every time we meet to a bookish place. And usually it has to do with the theme, and it's our job as a group to guess where's Andrew. Sometimes we get clues, sometimes not. So Andrew, do you have any clues that you're going to share with us this morning?
I am at a place connected to the Enlightenment.
Okay. A place connected to the Enlightenment. So I'm going to start off and say that Andrew is in England.
No.
France?
No.
Yes.
Oh,
France.
man. Yeah, I'm a
Paris.
second guess. No, good. That was
Paris?
really good.
I am in Paris, yes.
Ah, okay.
So, yeah. I'm sure there's a Biblioteca Nacional, National Library in Paris?
There is, but this is not it.
Oh, okay.
Tamara, you were on a roll. Okay, I know. I think, okay. I think
And if
that
anyone is interested, the French National Library did recently reopen to the public after being closed for renovations. So that's not relevant, not fully relevant, but it is nice to share.
Well, that's good to know. Okay, Andrew, I'm going to guess that you're in Paris, and that you are at the, I don't know if this place exists, but you are at the Library of the French Academy of the Sciences.
No.
Are you at the Sorbonne?
No. I will say this library is named after someone, and I think I once saw this person in a Monty Python sketch, which I know does not narrow it down any.
Is it named after a saint?
No, but it is someone church related.
Thanks.
Which Monty Python sketch was this referenced in?
I don't remember is the problem.
Is it, does it have to do, it doesn't have to do with René Descartes, does it?
It does not, no.
Okay, that rules out the whole philosopher's Monty Python skit.
Is the word royal in the name of this library?
It's not, no.
Okay. I think this name thing, this person, I feel like we're not gonna get it.
Is it, so you said it's named for a saint?
Not a saint, but someone connected to the church. This may confuse things more, but like think of birds or directions.
I know we're all Googling like crazy.
I know. Come on, Maggie, I can see your hands moving. Birds in direction. North, south, east, west?
Which are the what directions?
Cardinal.
Yes.
Oh.
Cardinal. Fill in the blank, library.
Richelieu.
It's not him.
No, Richelieu. Cardinal, okay. We're making progress here.
It's not Mitterrand.
No.
Okay, because he was political, he was a church.
I know, I saw it.
I found it, guys.
You did.
It's in the meeting.
Yeah.
Nazarene.
And
Bibliothèque Mazarine.
that's it.
Wow. Okay. Mazarine. Yeah. Okay.
It's where Antoine Lavoisier went to school at this. He went to the school where this library was, the Collège des Quatre Nations, and Jacques Louis David, however it's pronounced. I'm not great at French.
Oh, yeah.
Now it's part of the Institut de France.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Now we have our replica Gutenberg is based on the Mazarin Bible, isn't it? The Mazarin manuscript.
Oh, I think you're right. Oh my goodness.
But there's actually an additional connection to our collection.
Yeah, an additional, you're right. That's so
Cool.
interesting. And then someone had actually put it in the chat too. That's great.
Oh, I just saw that. I stole her thunder, sorry. Or their thunder, sorry.
Yay. Okay. Well, awesome. That was really hard, but that was a good one. Thank you so much. And as usual, Andrew does a whole handout for that location that he chose. And so that is now in the chat. You can download it from there. That was a really good one. Thank you so much, Andrew. And that was one that I think in a location that we don't always get to, we don't always think about as much. So yay, that was really, really great. It's always fun, stretches our brains a bit, wakes us up. Yay, well, thank you all so much for participating in that. So now we are going to go on to more of the content of our session. And it'll start, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Leah Benedict, who we are so lucky to have with us today. Dr. Leah Benedict is an assistant professor at Kennesaw State University, where she teaches English literature. Her teaching and research interests include 17th and 18th century British literature, the medical humanities, the history of children's literature, studies in science and technology, and disability theory. Today, Dr. Benedict is going to discuss one of the ways electrical devices appears in 18th century literature and kind of introduce us to some of her research interests. So we're so happy to have her. Dr. Benedict, thank you so much for being here. And she's got a presentation for us. Wonderful.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Joellen, for inviting me to present this. I'm very excited for the opportunity. So to give a little bit more context for this, and I guess some warning, the paper is about electricity and electrical devices, but it's also very specifically about how theories of electricity and the devices themselves were really changing the way that sex was being imagined and theorized in the 18th century, and also different ways that people were trying to actually revive sexual prowess in different bodies that had, run into obstacles. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and we will get going.
Wonderful. We can see it now.
Okay, excellent. All right.
And I just wanted to say, if you all have questions during the presentation, please do put them in the chat and we can ask them. Dr. Benedict is fine with us asking the questions during the presentation. So please do fill the chat with questions and we can have a conversation.
All right. Thank you. Okay, I will jump right in. Okay. The slack cadaver of a dismembered frog does not immediately suggest a potential balm for penile flaccidity. But, as Luigi Galvani discovered in the late 18th century, quote, when the nerves of a frog recently killed and deprived of its integuments are exposed to an electrified atmosphere, or in short, are so disposed as that by the action of an electrical machine or of any electrified body, a quantity of electric fluid is caused to pass through them, a contraction of the muscles takes place with a tremulous convulsive motion, which may be reiterated for some hours after. Though not resurrected, the dead creature's reaction to electrical stimulus promised other forms of medical revitalization. For if a corpse can be even temporarily enlivened, what might the electrification of living, though unresponsive, flesh produce? How might other organs benefit from that tremulous convulsive motion? And what passionate feelings might be renewed once they are in motion? These questions point not only to the promise of electrical therapy, but also to the conceptual difficulties bred from the two easy analogies between sympathy, electricity, anatomy, and interspecies connections over the 18th century. Together, the motions of sympathy and electricity gave shape to a tantalizing notion of holistic vitality that suffused the popular culture of the late 18th century Britain. So in vital theory, energy not only animates discrete beings, so individual organisms, but also unites each being with every other. So they would set up all of these different experiments and games where people would even gather together on street corners and hold hands, and they would create, generate an electric spark and apply it to the group, and everyone would collapse and feel this cascading energy. So these were really common events that were taking place in parlors and on street corners through most of the 18th century. And they started to think, well, what else can we substitute? So what if one of those bodies is replaced by a dog or a cow or a palm tree or something like that? Will this electrical energy still cascade through this crowd? And when it did, they became very confused about to what extent these different beings are at all even moderately separated from one another. To what extent can they actually replace one another in other relationships? The links forged between animate matter were the primary objects of study, for at their heart, 18th century electricity and sympathies were inquiries into relationships. Electricians asked what causes one kind of matter to attract or repel another, or to produce a static spark? What kinds of bodies will conduct that spark and which will disrupt it? How long can energy be sustained, and how many bodies might it affect before it weakens? Similar questions were driving theories of sympathy, for emotion, like energy, was perceived both as pervasive and genealogical. It exists invisibly and can manifest at any time given the proper conditions, but the course of its travels can be traced by its manifest symptoms. So here I examine vital electric energies at the cusp of their potential. Today, I'll be showing how the slippery figurative language of electric energy became a driving force behind the conceptual advancements of electrical inquiry. So to start, I just want to go into a little bit of detail about how electrical machines and the production of electricity were working at this time. So this was before they developed the battery in the early 19th century. So when 18th centurists are talking about electricity, they are primarily talking about electrostatic. And so the earliest versions of these machines were basically someone would take a brass pipe, so very similar to what you see in front of you, but just the brass pipe with the ball and the conductor in at the end. And they would hold it in their hand and take usually some felted wool or something to lend itself to the friction, and they would they would rub it really, really, really fast, like this, until a spark exploded from the end. So this is a more advanced model of that kind of machine. So here, instead of just the simple brass tube, what we see is a glass disc on the one hand that has a crank attached to it. Usually what would happen is an assistant would crank the glass wheel. Inside of the arched component over, like surrounding, clasping the glass wheel, that's where you find something like felted wool to generate static electricity. That conducts through the brass pipe, where they can either put it in proximity with a Leyden jar, which actually collects the static electricity, or they attach it to an implement that will animate, like various little metal artworks or little dancers or something along those lines, if they were doing it in a more performative way. Okay, so this is, again, a slightly more advanced model where instead we have a bigger disc and two of the brass pipes, which can produce even more of a static charge. And you get to see the assistant and kind of how the electrician would be speaking and explaining the components to the crowd. Okay. This is a Leyden jar. So what these were is they're glass vials that have foil around the bottom, and you can sort of see that in the shading and the gradation below the A. So glass foil surrounds the bottom part of the jar and lines the bottom. An electrical conductor goes through the top of the stopper, and they would usually have D, if you can see that at the top, that brass knob, that would be touching the electrostatic generator, and it would just fill with electric energy, static electricity. So the bigger the vial, the more it could actually contain. Excuse me. But one of the things that's really key about the way that these Leyden jars and static electricity works as compared to something like a battery is that they can only discharge it in one big go. So you have all of this collected and then it just goes in one big burst. So these were actually very, very powerful. We tend to think of static electricity as very small sparks, but the amount of energy being conveyed into these things was really dramatic. It could send people flying, it could stop hearts, it could do all kinds of things because it was just that powerful. And they hadn't yet learned how to sustain it through kind of that like low charge over time. So the way that they would work through that is they would use much smaller jars, have it touching, you can see the components here. So this is showing how they would be used for medical applications. So it would be a smaller jar, it would be charged up, and then it would sort of, because it was touching, they could touch somebody slowly over time to give them little amounts of electrical energy rather than those big kind of heart-stopping bursts.
I have a question, Leah. So some of the engravings that you've been showing, where would those have appeared? Are those in like periodicals or something like that?
Some of them. Most of these were found in books that were dedicated to either explaining how to construct or use different electrical devices that I found at the Huntington Library,
Oh, wow.
or was able to read there. Some of these would show up in things like newspaper advertisements because they would be saying like the latest and greatest of the latest designs, where to purchase or how to build. So some of them were even sold in kit form, similar to different like technological kits you can buy today.
Right. Fascinating.
Yeah. But they were really everywhere. They were really common. So just based on the design of these tools and the way that the electricity itself used, you can imagine that this, especially those early stages where they're doing like the manual charge with the one big burst at the end, right from the get-go, the language of electricity was really mirroring the language of sex. They just sounded the same. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples from different books that are not actually yet about sex, though they will become that way, just to get a sense of how this language is being written and utilized in the early parts of the 18th century. Okay, so this is Robert Boyle in the late 17th century, and he was one of those early scientists exploring the possibility of electricity. So he writes, heat, by agitating the parts of a fit body, solicits, as it were, to send forth its effluvia, which being heated, send forth their fragrant steams both further and more copiously than otherwise they would. All right, so we get bodies, we get effluvia, we get heat, we get sending forth. Next, we have R. Turner. This date was mangled, so somewhere in the 1740s. So let's see. All bodies in the universe may be properly divided into two classes, vis-a-vis electric and non-electric. Those bodies which attract and repel under the circumstances of attrition or rubbing are said to be electric. But those whose in which this virtue will not be so excited are said to be non-electric. So again, like the attraction and rubbing and electrified bodies, all of these different jokes started to like move through the century about those non-electric bodies, which might be impotent, which might be incapable. And they just borrowed wholesale this particular language of electricity. So now Father Giambattista Beccaria, and he's describing one of those brass tubes. So this is one of those earlier models of how he was generating his own electric current. So he says, this is my favorite of them. I commonly rub it by taking it between the index and the thumb of one of my hands, or between the most fleshy parts of both my hands, which, when they happen to be somewhat damp, prove excellent cushions, a little moisture being almost as efficacious as the amalgam. Okay, and then, finally, George C. Morgan in the 1790s. So after the excitation of some seconds, it is attended by the appearance of several little streams of the fluid passing from the points to the cushion. A sudden explosion very soon succeeds, together with a most brilliant display of the fluid in its passage from the inner to the outer coating. This effect is called spontaneous discharge. The operation of rubbing, when attended with effects I have now described, is called the excitation of a body.
So this is before we're getting into the joke part, right? This is like,
Yeah, this is all just deeply serious language about electricity. None of this is even mildly about sex. But you can see that this language is just like wildly suggestive. And this was recognized by a lot of people during the century in multiple ways. So we get these various jokes. This is a satire from the late 18th century. And you can see how they're just playing with the phallic imagery of the brass tubes and the conductors. So on the one side, we see James Graham, who is straddling a very phallic brass tube that says largest in the world. And on the other side, I can't actually recall who that particular electrician is, but we get positively charged. You might see some cats behind me, sorry. And in the language of their little speech bubbles, they're talking about virility and vitality and all of these words that are really specific to human sexuality. And James Graham, we'll look at maybe a little bit toward the end of my talk, but he actually was very much invested in these ideas that electric energy was kind of the the fundament of sex, and he created what's called the Temple of Health and Hymen. And you see that those words show up under the character to the left of this, Gog and Magog. One of them has kind of a front piece that says Temple of Health and Hymen. And this was a fantastic, like really fabulous place that James Graham constructed. So it was this opulent kind of place of business that had all of these various bedrooms that were arrayed around a central conductor. So somebody was at the bottom of this thing constantly cranking up static electricity using those generators. And they had various Leyden jars situated in kind of this array around these bedrooms. And they would connect to these beds that had, I mean, they're described in the most over the top ways, like dragons, like shapes of dragons' heads that touch each other with a point over the top of the bed, and have a static spark that you can see that cascades around the entire bed. And people would pay enormous sums of money to take their wives or their mistresses to have sex on these beds, with the promise that it would lead to greater chances of either erection or actually insemination, getting their wives pregnant if this was something that they were struggling with. So yeah, James Graham really took it to its distant extremes.
Was there any was it a successful place?
To a point, yeah. I mean, it was very exciting for people to be engaged under those circumstances. Also, the so much of this is really difficult because in the same way that the placebo effect affects trials presently, it was just, I mean, it was not quite as strong then. The placebo effect actually gets stronger every year. The more belief you have in something like pharmaceuticals or electricity, the better the results are going to be. So like distinguishing between how much was just people believing in and enacting the work of it and how much was the actual medical utility is really hard to separate. But
so
yes.
This would have been like in more of an elite crowd that was taking advantage of these I don't know, like these advancements, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But he did also have various books that he published and made very publicly available to. He was really interested in improving the lives and sex of really everyone. And he was very infamous in his time for all of the different remedies and implementations he came up with for these theories. Okay, so studies in electromagnetism began with the sudden motion of inert matter. So an iron rushing to a lodestone, so early just magnetic devices, or a feather clinging to a charged piece of amber, where they would take amber and chafe it, and then see like various things that would attach and float around it, kind of like we can do, like kids do with balloons in their hair. So an electricity should impart similar movement to the fleshy organs. What this simple arc guides us toward is a rich trove of literary analogies winding their way between works of science and sentiment, affecting the discourse so liberally that the division between literal and figurative connections becomes increasingly difficult to parse. Within the new discourse of electrical omnipresence, humans can be literally joined to other beings by way of electrical currents, and their parts can be supplanted by flowers, trees, frogs, eels, and orbs in ways that challenge the seeming figurative status of those substitutions. So take, for instance, two satirical poems published on the electric eel in the 1770s. The first, the electric eel, or Gemodus electricus, inscribed to the honorable members of the Royal Society, which was an august group of real scientists who often were the butt of many jokes. So written by one Adam Strong, a naturalist, which is a pseudonym. It retells the story of Eve's surrender to temptation, but replaces the snake with an electric eel that sets Eve aflame with desire. After successfully seducing Eve, the fabled eel proceeds to set all ladies' hearts on fire with its electric pricks. the poem is loaded with euphemisms and outright statements of sex, which only grow more pronounced as the writing unfolds. So one little excerpt. What makes our first felicity by this pure electricity divested of all fiction? Motion makes heat, and heat makes love. Creatures below and things above are all produced by friction. So this gives us, I guess, a more literary, practical application of how the language of the electrical devices with friction and heat and bodies is being circulated in these various other works that are like making the sexual connotations much more forward. So there was a sequel to this, a kind of follow-up by a Lucretia Lovejoy, also a pseudonym, so we're not sure who actually wrote this. The supposed sister to Adam Strong is, if anything, even less subtle in its penile allusions, beginning with the title, An Elegy Upon the Lamented Death of the Electric Eel, or Gymnotus Electricus, with the lapidary inscription as placed on a superb erection, and that is bolded, at the expense of the Countess of H. and Chevalier Madame d'Eon de Beaumont. In this follow-up, the electric eel has lost its vigor, and the poem is one very long impotence joke. So some excerpts. That eel which stood erect in beauty's pride and nodded to and fro its coral head, worshipped by untaught Indians far and wide, like other creatures, is not stiff, though dead. Limber and lank the heaven-born charmer lies, from every virgin's hand with scorn 'tis hurled. No maid can make the poor torpedo rise. Limp as a dishclout, it forsakes the world. And it keeps going for many, many pages of this. I mean, it just does not stop. So the influence of these analogies upon the developing sciences cannot be overstated. Karen Harvey writes that, quote, through techniques such as the obscene word and descriptions of the sex act, an illusion of greater proximity to the body is created, and sex takes on a realistic quality. Erotica also creates an illusion, but it is an illusion which places bodies and sex at a distance. A variety of strategies might be employed in this process. Bodies might be made conspicuously absent by being clothed in garments, placed outside the narrative, or in this case, veiled through the use of extended metaphors. But metaphor, and this is end quote, but metaphor doesn't only create distance between the viewer and the sexual explicitness. It proliferates and amplifies certain kinds of ideas, and this thus guides our treatment of the tenor and object of the metaphor. So the tenor being the vehicle, the word that is advancing a particular idea, and the object being the thing that is being referenced. So we have electrical metaphors acting as vehicles for the body, for different sex parts, whether primarily the penis, but also the uterus, also the nerves, and the emotional qualities that are supposed to exist between a couple, the sparks, the heat, the friction, all of that. So these metaphors were really guiding particular treatments, and this is true even today. So there's a lot of research in contemporary science about how those first metaphors that we use to describe things that we haven't yet really developed a distinct vocabulary for, they end up actually limiting and guiding how people approach the thing in question. So a different example from the science of sex is when microscopes were first being used to examine all of these different fluids and body parts and textures and all of these things. When they put semen under the microscope, they had no idea what to make of the things that were swimming inside of it. And they were finding swimming things literally in everything, in water, in milk, in, even across like, hard surfaces, just finding all of these tiny beings that were mobile. So when they saw this in semen, they didn't really understand that was actually one of the things that leads to insemination. And they called them worms in the beginning. And in part due to this, the capacity to recognize how sex worked was delayed probably by 100 years because it wasn't until the very late 18th century, early 19th century that they confirmed that those things actually do something to the egg. So for a long time, they treated them like parasites. And so the language really does shape how people are actually constructing their studies and applying them to various bodies. Concrete references to how the genitals and love and lust were packaged in the language of heat, electricity, magnetic attraction, and energy did exist also. So we're going to see and compare the language where these people were actually talking also about sex. So William Belcher, writing as a rational mystic, was how he published himself in a work titled Intellectual Electricity from the late 1790s, writes, "Is not also the passion of love caused by oxygen, actuated by electricity? Are not persons reciprocally in love and beloved, in kind of electrified machines, igniting both negatively and positively, not only to each touch, but also at each glance and motion? And does not the science of allurement consist much in the practice of directing with dexterity the more than metaphorical, the real, though invisible, arrow of mysterious contagion?" Which would be love and desire. Okay, and then Anthony Fothergill, in A New Inquiry into the Suspension of Vital Action, he writes, "Why, according to the degree of excitement and the nature of the passion, the human is equally calculated to beam with benign radiance or to flash with indignant lightning. Hence the impassioned eye is keen to sparkle with joy, to glisten with pity, to shed tears and grief. Hence the language of the eyes is universally understood even by illiterate people of all nations, and is allowed by lovers to be far more eloquent than that of speech. Hence those brilliant emanations darted from their eyes when their bosom glows with intense passion. Hence those fiery scintillations when it is inflamed with jealousy or burns with inexorable rage." So electricity being the thing that creates all emotion and actually sends it out in rays from a person to cause a similar reaction in other electrified bodies that are responsive to that kind of motion. Okay, and then Thomas Gale, in Electricity or Ethereal Fire Considered, writes, "This elementary fire not only exists in animal bodies on an equilibrium with those substances with which they are constantly connected, but the common air, especially when cool, imbibes a large proportion of this elastic fire. The lungs inspire this air, the fire mingled with it, dispersed through the pulmonary vessel into the blood. The whole mass of fluids are, in a degree, fermented and enlivened, and the vessels being at the same time more filled and distended, their tone is quickened and the circulation accelerated. All the animal functions are, in part, put in and preserved in motion, and the whole system is invigorated by this single agent of electricity." So the metaphorical substitutions and suggestive language culminate in the work of Charles Hunnings Wilkinson, one of the first physicians to describe the application of an electrical conductor directly to the genitals. To Charles Hunnings Wilkinson, the body is a system of energy organized by organic, sympathetic exchange between its parts. He promises that electrification might revive a man's penis where other remedies have failed, and he seems to indicate that the genitals are the body's own portable Leidenfile, or electrical container, both generating and storing the body's energy. Electricity promises to recharge the genitals and thus reinvigorate the person. C.H. Wilkinson's clinical explanation and essay on the Leidenfile, he writes, "Perhaps in no affection of the human body is the influence of electricity so remarkable as in this disease. The languid, melancholy state into which the whole system is thrown. When the testes perform not their proper function, is a case which frequently occurs to every practitioner. The patient, low, nervous, and irritable, fancies he labors under every disease he hears mentioned. He seems equally averse to every exertion as well as to any sexual converse. the whole frame sympathizing so powerfully with the inactive state of the testes itself becomes torpid. In this case, the greatest care is requisite in the administration of electricity. The form in which it is beneficial is by an uninterrupted stream from a charged battery. If we were to make use of shocks through so delicately construed glands as the testes, we might subject them to considerable injury. By such a gentle and continuous stimulus, the testes will be roused into their native action, the proper secretion take place, and thus the languid state of the whole system removed. So Wilkinson avoids any obfuscation and euphemism and makes explicit connections between electrical fluids and the male parts. If the testes under consideration are merely sluggish with no attendant inflammation, gentle shocks should be sufficient to rouse them into action. His description is notable, however, for the way the process of repair remains mysterious. The genital parts might be named and their relationships known, but his application is not surgical in the sense that it rearranges the interior. Rather, it redistributes energy and potentially reroutes its pathways through the body. Unresponsive testes lack energy, which his therapeutic process will resupply. So these various works help us to see how the body and energy and death and vitality were being refigured by electrical discourses and theories of resuscitation. And of course, we've made marvelous headway with these ideas. They actually do have a lot of applications, which we've learned in hospitals. We see it on TV all the time, where people are resuscitated with electric shocks to the heart. We see it in early proto-science fiction, where Victor Frankenstein, pulls together all of these various parts of a corpse, constructs them back into a human shape, and brings them to life with the electric pulse. But one of the things that this really captures is that at the time, they were really starting to see the human body not just as a thing that performs actions, that exists for a finite amount of time, but that requires a constant stimulus from its environment. That it was a reflexive relationship, not just an autonomous creation. And so this field of vital theory was really one that saw the entire world as a sort of energy exchange, where every single participant was, giving and receiving all of these electronic sparks in the form of emotion, in the form of radiance, in the form of visibility, and all of these sensory movements that were taking place. And one of the things that I think is just so fascinating about this is that when these ideas were overturned, when they said, no, every being is discrete, we're going to analyze them as separate beings, that was one of the things that actually put more recent inquiries into things like environmental studies, into ecosystems, into all of the ways that we actually do start to think of the world as a kind of organism that requires an internal balance of participation from all of its parts. That's something that we're really having to go back and re-examine, that the rejection of vital theories really delayed us. So there are lots of ways that these various studies, whether that they're by electricity proper or the way that they were applying it to sex, can really help us rethink the various hidden metaphors or driving metaphors and ideologies that are really shaping how we see human relationships between one another and the rest of the world. So that concludes my talk. And if there are any questions or comments, I would love to discuss them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benedict, or Leah. I call you Leah. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And it's one of those things where we've got several 18th century texts in the rare book room, and I just have never really noticed anything related to that. So that is fascinating. We were having an interesting conversation in the chat regarding that illustration, kind of with that kind of phallic illustration, because we were talking about why it was kind of titled The Quacks. There was a great conversation going on in the chat. Do you have any comments on that?
So sorry, I've got a cat who is joining.
Aw, yay.
So the quack was the common term for people who were selling remedies and devices that promised to improve everything. So various tinctures, various implements, and they were considered people who were untrained and basically just selling hopes and dreams rather than like practical works. But there's a lot of work on this. Roy Porter was a medical historian who did quite a bit of work on quackery. And he was really insistent that the line between quacks and actual practitioners was so porous. For one, a lot of the quacks actually came up with ideas like the medical electricity that have really taken off, that we see the utility in. And a lot of the so-called trained medical practitioners were doing things that in hindsight, we are just marvelously horrified by. But yeah, so James Graham was popularly recognized as a quack during his time, even though he had a really huge following.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for that, because there was some great conversation going on there. Does anyone have additional questions for Dr. Benedict?
I had a question. The concept of a lack of vocabulary limiting progress in terms of research. So is that because there is an agreement among the body of researchers, or is it because the observations are confusing, people don't know what they are, and therefore it takes a while to identify what they're seeing and give it a name? And does it occur the same way with a body of researchers versus an individual?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's both individuals and bodies of researchers. So one of the things that was happening, especially with the use of the microscope, is they were just encountering things that they had not a single kind of word that was available to them. And anytime that happens, historically speaking, whenever we come across a thing that we don't actually have a ready word for, we use a prior word. So we usually use an analogy or a metaphor that sort of serves as either a temporary or a longstanding container for this new concept. And an example for this, actually, where the metaphorical use of the word has overtaken the prior historical use of the word, is cell. So Robert Hooke, when he was looking at all of these different, substances under his microscope, and he was the one who did micrographia and has the famous etching of the flea blown up. When he saw that plants and even things like silk and leather have all of these tiny filaments inside of them, the best word he could come up with was a cell, which is a very small room in a monastery that a monk would live in. So the way that they are these very tiny spaces clustered together. And now when we think of cell, no one thinks of a monastery quarters as the primary thing that comes to mind. We think of the, single-celled organism or a skin cell or whatever it happens to be. And so that's one of those cases where the metaphor overtook the original meaning of the word. Metaphors they saturate scientific language. And it's one of those things that makes literary study of science so fun and rewarding, is that we can go in and really analyze what those metaphors are and how they're really shaping the direction of thought that was being organized around these new concepts. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question, Barbara. Thank you so much. Well, if anyone has additional questions for Dr. Benedict, please do put it in the chat. Thank you so much again, Leah, for that wonderful presentation. And you make it, it's the connection. It seems like, okay, was this really a connection? But clearly it was. And so that, I just think that's so exciting and great, and really eye-opening as well. So Oh, well, we do have one additional question. How did the religious establishment react to these theories? That's a really great question, Adina. We'll go ahead, Lee, if you want to answer that, and then we'll go on to the next part of our program.
Yeah, and just to like elaborate on that just a little bit, like I know that the Enlightenment period is often characterized as this reaction, away from religiously oriented viewpoints and structures, but I always thought that was likely a little bit oversimplified, because people tend to study it as this intellectual trend, but obviously there are people who are reacting against that at the same time. I'm just curious how much you know about that from this particular standpoint.
Yeah, that's a great question. Luigi Galvani, the one who performed the experiment on the frog, was in fact a priest, or maybe monk is the more appropriate word. A lot of these developments were actually taking place. I mean, monasteries were very much scientific institutions because they had the time and the space to actually perform them. So while his work on reanimating dead flesh got him in a lot of trouble with the church, the broader discourse on electricity being the sort of omnipresent force connecting everything, a lot of people in the church really loved because it seemed to be immediate and active proof of God's presence. And so there's all of this poetry that uses electricity and electrical analogies as this like very much like spiritual force. So they were very receptive to the work on electricity up to a certain particular point, which is don't bring the dead back to life.
Again, great question, Adina. And thank you, Leah. That's fascinating. And I'm glad, Adina, you kind of like talked about that because, again, we do tend to kind of oversimplify these things in like general speech. And so it is good to kind of think about, how different viewpoints were actually, how they were interpreting this and what they liked about it and what they didn't. So thank you so much for that. I did want to show the group in our rare book collection. As you might imagine, we have a lot of really interesting 18th century texts that discuss different aspects of science and medicine and even electricity as well. Some of these pieces I was actually able to show to Dr. Benedict's class last week, which was really exciting. I know that they enjoyed it very much. So I wanted to just give you all a couple, just a very brief survey, just some pictures of some materials in case you're interested in doing research on some of our 18th century science texts. So I'm just going to show you a couple pictures here. Let me see if I can get it to the right spot. Hopefully I can get it in the presentation view. I'm going to start with that. So I wanted to show this example here. The title's a little bit cut off from the scan, but it translates to Suite of Memories of Mathematics and Physics from the Registers of the Royal Academy of Sciences in the year 1741. So this is why this is actually is a book that's talking about different projects that were undertaken by members of the Royal Academy of the Sciences, now what is called the French Academy of the Sciences, established by Louis XIV. And so this is a really, really interesting, it has these wonderful fold outs as well. Most of our medical texts do. So it looks like, so it's just these really, so again, this text is in French, but it's, it has a leather binding, and again, all the different fold outs that relate to different projects. So beautiful engravings. So I wanted to just show that as an example. I haven't quite figured out, I didn't have enough time to see which animal is kind of being described through this engraving here, but I'll have to take a closer look at that. Let's see, next slide. Let me try to get the next one. Yes. Oh, this is one of my favorites. So this is Astronomy Explained Upon Sir Isaac Newton's Principles from 1770 in a calfskin binding. And my favorite part of this astronomy book is this fold out, it's an orrery, which is a mechanical model of the solar system. This text also includes several diagrams of the solar system and illustrative explanations of phenomena like the solar eclipse. So here's another example of an engraving that appears in this book. Next, we have the philosophical transactions giving some account of the present undertaking, studies, and labors of the ingenious in many considerable parts of the world. What a title. But basically, this again is a compilation of projects that were undertaken by members of the Royal Society in the UK in the year 1764. So this is it's recounting the projects of the Royal Society of London. It's now just called the Royal Society. But the Royal Society of London was established in 1660, so it's very old and still very prestigious today. And what I really like is the diversity of projects and topics represented here. Everything ranging from the account of a let's see, oh, there's an armadillo. That was the account of an American armadillo. And then we've got, let's see, I think I had a little, yeah, the mummy foot. I may have shown this to some people before, but this was an investigation of a mummy that was inspected at London. They've got projects relating to fossils and even electricity. So I'm going to go back and look at the electricity project, of course, see if I see anything interesting. So there's just a whole lot that this text gives us, which is exciting. And then kind of moving away from strictly our scientific text, wanted to show that in our rare book collection, we also have some really, really interesting materials documenting 18th century politics and just society. Like, for example, we've got many, many issues of newspapers like the Boston Gazette and Country Journal. So this is from 1773. And this is a Salem Gazette from 1782. So as you can see, it's really, really fun. You can look at all of these. You can touch these with your hands and actually hold and really analyze these periodicals if you come for a research appointment. We also have some digitized. So anyway, wanted to let you all know that these are some things we have. And then for our finale, our crown jewel that I kind of wanted to talk about, not this one. This one. This is our copy of the Declaration of Independence. So again, this is one of the most important 18th century pieces in United States history. And our piece is not actually from 1776, but our copy is from 1843. And I don't know if y'all are familiar with the history of the printing of the Declaration of Independence, but just to summarize, in the 1820s, Secretary of State John Adams realized that the Declaration was in a very difficult, it was starting to deteriorate and something needed to be done. And so he commissioned William J. Stone to make a copperplate engraving of the Declaration, which was then used to print 200 copies of the document on parchment in 1823. 20 years later, Peter Force was commissioned to print 1,500 additional copies of the Declaration on paper for inclusion of a 9-volume set of books called the American Archives. Well, Peter Force did not complete this series, and he only printed about 500 copies of the Declaration on paper, and now only about half of those exist. And one of those is here at the Bentley Rare Book Museum. And so we would like to get some conservation work done on this piece. It needs some mending, it needs reframing and rebacking. And so we are raising $6,000 to cover the cost of conservation of this piece so that we can use it for teaching and outreach, and then of course, so that it can persist into the future. So since we were already talking about the 18th century, I thought I would mention this part of what we're trying to do to make sure we take care of these pieces. So I would, if y'all don't mind, I would like to put the I would actually like to put the link to the fundraiser in the chat. If anyone is interested, it's a crowdfunded fund. And so we are very, very excited to get this going. KSU is behind us and supporting us and helping us do this. So anyway, I would like to make a special shout out to the Bramlett family. Andrew representing the Bramletts. Thank you for being the very first donors to our fundraiser. Thank you so much, Andrew and family. But anyway, I know we are at 11 o'clock, but I wanted to see if we could please give either a virtual or a actual round of applause to Dr. Leah Benedict for her wonderful talk. And thank you so much, Dr. Benedict, for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you all for joining. This was fascinating. In just an hour, we looked at the Enlightenment in several different ways. Again, thank you all so much for making time for this. And if you have questions about or questions for Dr. Benedict, I'm happy to, you email me, I'm happy to send those over to her. If you have questions about our fundraiser, please do let me know. I'm happy to send you any links or more information if you would simply like to know more before you get giving. So if you enjoyed this program and you are not on our Coffee with a Curator listserv, please do send a message to rarebooks@kennesaw.edu and you'll get on the listserv and you'll know about our programs every month. Next month is October, and I believe our next program is going to be on October 19th, but I will check that date. And I will send, of course, a message to everyone who's interested. So thank you again, Dr. Benedict. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Great to see you all today. All right. Bye.